This Sunday's sermon will conclude the Lenten series as we've talked about glimpses from the final week of Jesus' life. And today we're going to talk about Good Friday, and I think it's great to do that on a Sunday because so often on Good Friday we're not this full. I think Jeff had a great suggestion, but I think we're not this full always, and sometimes even when we do, we don't get there and get the whole story. And so today, we really want to look at Good Friday and what that means for each and every one of us. Because it is an important day in this final week of Jesus' life, not just because of his death on the cross, but how it fits into the whole story as we've talked about before during this Lent. How everything is framed in this final week of Jesus' life. And today we come to the story of the cross and Jesus' example for us, Jesus modeling for us a life of faith that climaxes in suffering and passion and death. And that's the we have. In fact, we've often been called people of the cross. And today is a day to remember that, to recall that we are people of the cross, and then to decide for each one of us gathered here today, what does it truly mean in our lives to say we are people of the cross? What will that mean for you as you move forward from this day? Good Friday, I believe, is the pivotal day. It's the day when we have to begin to look at things differently. Can you imagine how the disciples and those gathered around him had to look at things differently on that day, that Good Friday? Because they had to do so many things. One of the things, they could no longer put their hope that Jesus was going to come and create a new world order in that time and in that place. They could no longer see themselves as seeking earthly power. They could no longer look for the Messiah as a path back to the garden, back to paradise. They could no longer look for those kind of things in earthly power for once and for always. For those gathered around the cross, those hiding and crouching in the shadows that day, Jesus' death signified a very important thing. Paradise was lost forever. And there was the dawning of a new age with that. I think sometimes what we do as people of faith, we rush. We rush through all of Holy Week, but especially we rush through Good Friday. We want to put aside those images of suffering and death and pain, all those images of self-sacrifice on the cross, and we want to rush to Easter. Isn't Easter a lot better? I mean, don't you think so? I mean, who wants to think about pain and death when we can think about, covered eggs and chickens and rabbits? And I don't know why all those things are Easter anymore. But we do want to rush to the empty tomb, and we just want to rush right by the cross. And when we rush by the cross, we miss so much. We miss the meaning of faith for our own lives. And people have rushed by the cross for years. Many have failed to see what it's all about. They failed to see what a suffering and dying Messiah might have to say for us, not only 2,000 years ago, but today in our faith journey. It's been said by many that suffering, the act of suffering, creates more atheists than any other thing. Because somehow we've passed on as people of faith that if you're a person of faith, there is no suffering. And yet Jesus, in his example for us, shows us just the opposite. A life of faith not only embraces suffering, but you live it out yourself. The suffering and sacrifice is part of what it means to be a Christian. So it's easy to miss that, and it's easy to push it to the side because it's not very pleasant, is it? I mean, I would much rather think about Easter, wouldn't you? I mean, who wants to think about that kind of passion and suffering in their life? And I want to tell you, if you find no hope in Good Friday, you're not the first ones. Think about the disciples. Think about all those gathered in this story that we know so well on that Good Friday. Think about Peter. You remember how he messed up? We talked about it last week in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then this week, we see him denying Jesus on this very day. He acts like he doesn't know him because he's not ready for Jesus' death. He thinks thinks that's the wrong way. It's not the way we're supposed to go. And remember some of those other disciples who just a few weeks ago had been arguing about who was going to be in charge when Jesus left? Remember those stories? And who was the greatest? And now they're hiding, they're cowering in fear because they think it's all over. They think all that Jesus was about now is finished, but in a way that's a failure. And how about Judas who betrayed him? He betrayed him because Judas was looking for that earthly power that so many of us still look for today. We as people of faith think somehow if we could just get a hold of the power in this world, in this earth, if we could be the ones in charge, then things would be better. And that's why Judas betrayed Jesus. Because Jesus said, no, earthly power is not what it's about. Being in charge isn't what it's about. And so Judas was so disappointed in Jesus and his failure to just grab control of the world that he betrayed him. And how about the crowds that were gathered around? We talked about it on Palm Sunday, the day we talked about Palm Sunday. They were shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna. And less than a week later, they were shouting, crucify him. Because they wanted worldly power. They wanted Jesus to sweep in and kick the Romans out. And so often that's the way it is. And so here we find ourselves on this Good Friday, confused like they were. What is the meaning of this Good Friday? I mean, we rush past the cross so much. How many of us have really spent time in prayer and meditation saying, what does this cross mean for us? And all of us on this day, we have to deal with one important thing. It's those words that Jesus left us with. What did it say in the scripture today? Jesus said, it is finished. And then he gave up his spirit. What does that mean? I thought it was finished on Easter. Didn't you? But whatever Jesus wants to get across to us, the message of the cross is that it finished it. It's an amazing thing. You know, theologians have spent the last 2,000 years deciding exactly what the cross was about. And if you read much theology, you can read a lot of grand words and grandiose theories. And we talk about the atonement theory. And we talk about words like substitution and expiation. And oh, they're all such great words. But what does it really mean for me and for you? When Jesus utters those words, it is finished. Paul Hessert is a theologian that wrote a book a few years back, not that many years ago. And the title of the book was Christ and the End of Meaning. What Hessert suggests in that book, and it seems to fit so well with the story and the confusion of the disciples and the confusion of those gathered around Jesus, that what died with Jesus on that cross that day was the way we make meaning, or at least the way people have always made meaning. Because we've always made meaning with winning. We've always made meaning in victory. That's why we wanted to go back to the garden, back to perfection. And so we've sought to make meaning with victory, and so we jump to Easter and we say, oh, we've won, we've won. But Jesus said on the cross, it is finished now. Not with Easter, not with an empty tomb, but with his death on a cross. And so we begin to look at how have we been making meaning in our lives and how can we make meaning now? That's what Good Friday is about. Hessert said it this way: the crucifixion means that the Messiah is dead. There is no longer hope of salvation in the terms of cultural understanding like wisdom and like power. Things have changed. Here's the story. Jesus' death ended any hope of seizing power in earthly ways for his disciples. And yet today we still grasp, somehow hoping to claim victory in earthly ways. But the story was clear. Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus fulfilled the law. Jesus was dead. It is finished. So Good Friday challenges us in new ways. I know why people stay away from Good Friday now, don't you? Do you want to hear it's finished? Do you want to hear that the way of the cross is the way of our life? Did you want to hear that you're called to a life of suffering and sacrifice? No, we don't want to hear that. We want to hear Easter stories. We want to hear the joy of Easter. But you see, we have to grapple with the meaning of Jesus' death. Because when we don't, it can lead to a misunderstanding of the call of our lives. You see, Paul reminds us that we are called to pick up our crosses and follow Jesus. Remember? In fact, Paul even says, we are crucified with Christ. I think there's a problem, though. We may be crucified with Christ, but we keep getting back down off the cross. We don't like it up there very much. We don't think it should be finished with suffering and sacrifice. Aren't we supposed to somehow win in the end? Aren't we supposed to claim victory in the end? You see, we're called to do it differently. William Sloane Coffin, whose son, anybody doesn't know William Sloane Coffin, I probably should say who he is. He's so familiar to me. He was perhaps the greatest preacher of the last century. He was at Riverside Church in New York City. Coffin's son died at either 21 or 22 in a car accident. And what Coffin said was that God was in the midst of that pain. He said when his son died, God was the first heart to break. He said that we have a God who shares our suffering with us because God has suffered. It's an amazing thing when you think about it. You see, our God is different because our God shares in our suffering. And the cross is a reminder, Good Friday is a reminder that we're called to suffer and to sacrifice and to give. Not with money, but with our lives. And we may not win in earthly terms in the end. We can write all the hymns we want about victory in Jesus. But victory in Jesus is death on a cross. All the disciples were martyred. Don't forget that. None of them went to sleep peacefully in the middle of the night. They were all martyred. They all died for their faith. That's what Jesus is calling us to on Good Friday. I know why you don't come on Good Friday. You don't want to hear that. You don't want to be reminded of that. Shoot, I don't want to be reminded of that. But the call of the cross and the call of Good Friday is the call for us, for each of us. It's what we're called to do. I didn't know if I was going to tell you this or not, but I decided to go ahead and do it. But I had a good friend, still a good friend, even though he lives back in the Midwest, and we met on a spiritual retreat. And just about the same time, we were called to go into the ministry, and we decided to do that. And when we went into the ministry, we went to different seminaries. I went to one in Chicago, and he went to one in Indianapolis. So I served a little church in the North Shore of Chicago area, and John served this little country church in the middle of northern Indiana with his family, with his 4 children. John was a great guy, and he was in seminary. And I remember coming back to visit in Indiana for Christmas break and turning on the TV. And I turned on the TV, and there was a story on the TV about a tragedy. As I began to listen to the story, it sounded familiar. They hadn't mentioned any names yet. And what happened was, John was with his family, and one of his daughters was gone. And they were in this rickety old parsonage like you find in the country in the Midwest sometimes. And it was late in the evening, and they all went to bed, and John's bedroom was on the first floor, and the children were on the second floor. And John woke up in the middle of the night to the house on fire. And there was no way to get to the second floor. And John tried. And John went outside and tried to get a ladder. But nothing worked. And John was helpless and hopeless as 3 of his children perished in a fire while he was trying his best to serve God. I always knew in that moment that John could have abandoned faith if he was trying to make sense out of what happened in terms of winning in this world, John could have said, forget it. There is no hope. There is no God. I cannot believe a God will allow that to happen. If he was trying to make sense out of the life and the tragedy in the terms of power and weakness, he would have just given up. But John didn't give up. John continued to live his life. John continued to go to seminary. John continues to be a pastor to this day, serving other people, because he chose to live his life in the shadow of the cross, not making meaning of the loss, but making meaning that he had a God that suffered with him in this loss. That he had a God whose heart broke when those children died. That he had a God who cried with him. It took a long time before John returned to the John I knew. But as he made steps on that journey, I knew he made those steps because he understood the meaning of the cross and the meaning of Good Friday. He understood what Jesus did for us. I've heard it said by many preachers that you could only understand Good Friday in the light of Easter. It's something we like to say because, we're just like you. We want to rush past Good Friday. We want to rush past the cross and the call to suffer. I want to say something else to you today. You can only understand Easter in the light of Good Friday. You see, Good Friday gives meaning to our life. It doesn't guarantee us victory, not in worldly terms. It guarantees us a God that walks with us in the midst of all our suffering and all we do. It promises us a God that will lead us to the cross, but walk with us hand in hand. It's a reminder that our God gave everything for us, and that our God calls us to give everything for others, and to truly become people of the cross. Today, we're going to offer communion, and you can renew your faith journey. But after you commune, you'll see some pictures here. And we're going to have water in those. And if you've been baptized, we encourage you to just run your fingers through the water for a minute to remember your baptism. Because whether you realize it or not, the scriptures say we are baptized into the life and death of Jesus Christ. So what a better day to remember our baptism and our call to the cross. And so I will also say, I will be here in the middle, and if anyone has never been baptized and would like to be baptized today, if you would, after you receive communion, come to the middle, then I will baptize you this day, so that you too may be baptized into the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to encourage you to think that. That is my challenge to you, is to live this life with such passion and commitment that everyone will know that you are people of the cross and called to live by example. I'm going to wrap the little message up today with a song about the way of the cross. And Jeff's going to sing that for us. So prepare your hearts to be reminded